From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court seeks arrest warrants for both Hamas leaders and Israel's top politicians as President Biden denounces the moral equivalence. But what action will Biden take? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, Elliot Kaufman and Bill McGurn. On Monday, the International Criminal Court announced that it was seeking arrest warrants for both Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense chief, as well as 3 Hamas leaders responsible for the October 7th massacre. Let's start with a clip of that prosecutor on CNN.
We've applied today, we'll apply for warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and also Minister of Defense Gallant for crimes of causing extermination, causing starvation as a method of war, including the denial of humanitarian relief supplies, deliberately targeting civilians in conflict. And the sad thing really is in relation to both categories. I have been saying repeatedly in Cairo in October last year, at the Rafah crossing, on Israeli television, in Ramallah, everywhere I can, to the parties to the conflict: comply now, don't complain later.
And here is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responding on Good Morning America.
It's a hit job. It's not serious. He's out to defame Israel. And he's also pouring gasoline on the fires of anti-Semitism that are spreading around the world, because he is attacking the one and only Jewish state and trying to handcuff us, preventing us from exercising responsibly through the laws of war as we obey them and we are subordinate to them. He's saying we're not. He's creating false symmetry, false facts, and he's doing a grave injustice to the International Court.
Elliot, maybe the place to start is, can you give us a sense of what the International Criminal Court is, and what do you make of the charges that it unveiled on Monday?
The ICC is easily confused with the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, where Israel stands accused by South Africa. Now, both are in The Hague in the Netherlands. ICJ is a civil tribunal that hears disputes between nations. So South Africa versus Israel. ICC, on the other hand, which is what we are talking about now, is a criminal tribunal that prosecutes individuals like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, individuals in member states, states that elect to sign its treaty. What did it do? On Monday, ICC prosecutor Karim Ahmed Khan of Britain requested arrest warrants for these 2 Israeli leaders on charges, as we heard, of using starvation as a weapon, other war crimes such as targeting civilians. And he also requested arrest warrants for Hamas's 3 leaders, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Def, and Ismail Haniyeh, the last of whom is sitting pretty in Qatar right now. And those were for all the crimes of October 7th that have been pretty well documented.
Bill, one of the biggest things that sticks out to me here is the drawing some moral equivalence between these two sides. On one hand, you have democratic leaders in Israel that are responding to a terrorist attack on civilians that killed something like 1,200 Israelis, including Americans. And some of the people that were kidnapped and taken into Gaza that day are still being held hostage. And then on the other side, you have the perpetrators, the masterminds of that attack. The equivalence is one of the things that President Biden honed in on. This is a piece of his statement from Monday. The ICC prosecutor's application for arrest warrants against Israeli leaders is outrageous. And let me be clear, whatever this prosecutor might imply, there's no equivalence, none, between Israel and Hamas. Bill, I wonder what you make of that.
First of all, Joe Biden is exactly right. It is outrageous. Second of all, the equivalence is the aim. After October 7th, Hamas had a real problem in the court of world opinion. I mean, it massacred civilians, women, grandmothers, mothers, children. How do you defend that? And I think we've seen the answer to say Israel is just as bad as we are. No one's really saying Hamas was right. They're just saying Israel's, in fact, worse than we are because the numbers are so much bigger. And this is part of it. The ICC when it was started, Clinton signed the treaty when he was the lame duck in 2000. Then under the Bush administration, it was rescinded. So we're not a party member to it. It's a fake court. And to take this case against Israel, which is not a member, doesn't have jurisdiction, it does so on talking about the state of Palestine. It's just fiction. It's not rooted in anything, no checks and balances. It's like letting Greta Thunberg rule the APA. It's just a fiction. I think to get too bogged down in the technicalities is a mistake, to give it any legitimacy. I'm hoping that the silver lining for all this is that we'll get the U.S. to put pressure on its allies who fund it to withdraw their funding. So they may have overstepped with this. It's so ridiculous. And also, it's just impractical. How the heck could they execute the warrants on the Hamas leadership? It's impossible.
Elliot, what's your analysis of the substance of the charges saying that these two Israeli leaders, including Netanyahu, in the words of the prosecutor, bear criminal responsibility for the following war crimes and crimes against humanity, including what we've mentioned, starvation of civilians and intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population as a war crime?
I agree with Bill that the allegations are pretextual, but there are also answers to them. On the point about starvation, it's worth noting that the ICC isn't just saying that this was an Israeli tactic at some point in the war, maybe the first 10 days when they can point to various aggressive statements in those traumatic days when Israel was not allowing entry into Gaza of anything for the first 10 days. This is while there were supplies in Gaza and while those supplies were being drawn down. But ICC isn't just saying that there was something wrong that happened in those 10 days. It's saying that Israel has been using starvation the whole time and is still using starvation as a tactic. And I think the case for that is incredibly weak because Israel can say and demonstrate that it has facilitated the entry under very difficult circumstances of 500,000 tons of aid, of almost 30,000 aid trucks, all while Hamas, the enemy, has been stealing it, commandeering these trucks, attacking them, making it extraordinarily difficult. This is a sort of unprecedented effort to supply the enemy's civilian population, even while the enemy is benefiting from those supplies. And so Israel can say, certainly now, but at different stages as well, that it has been going above and beyond here. And then on the second point, targeting civilians, Israel's war effort has been hyper-targeted. And it can point to all the things that it has been doing that other armies simply don't do. Long periods of civilian evacuations, warnings by text, leaflet, phone, daily humanitarian pauses, providing civilians with the Israeli military's own maps about where they will be fighting neighborhood by neighborhood, all while Hamas poses an unprecedented urban warfare challenge, fighting out of hundreds of miles of fortified tunnels underneath cities, doing whatever they can to keep civilian human shields next to them, above them, all of that, stop civilians from fleeing. Egypt stops civilians from fleeing. You have this unprecedented challenge, and Israel has been able to achieve, by most estimates, a notably low civilian to combatant casualty ratio for this kind of urban warfare.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. On the point about trying to avoid civilian casualties, this is a quote from John Spencer, a chair of urban warfare at West Point. He says, Israel has done more to prevent civilian casualties in war than any military in history. He adds that it's setting a standard that will be both hard and potentially problematic to repeat, unquote. And Bill, part of what I think is interesting about that is there's a distinction that we're drawing here between collateral damage and civilian casualties that are incidental and unintentional, but unavoidable in this kind of urban warfare, and what Hamas does, which is intentionally targeting civilians. And the point that John Spencer is making in that quote is that this is not going to be the last war against a terrorist organization. And if this is the standard that Israel is setting and it is not enough for the ICC, then that may be a problem when other powers, including the United States, go after ISIS or go after Al-Qaeda or other groups like that in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree with everything Elliot said. He mentioned the civilians, the ratio of civilians killed to Hamas leaders and so forth. I think Israel's numbers, even using Hamas's numbers, I think they compare favorably to, say, the U.S. record in Fallujah and Mosul when we fought in the cities and everything. It's just so dishonest, fundamentally dishonest. And I would go further and say the International Criminal Court is designed to be dishonest. It has no accountability. They can issue anything. It's not even clear these arrest warrants will be signed by the court itself. It's a prosecutor, and they just have unchecked power, but they're key in a propaganda war. The obvious goal is to dirty up Israel and say, you're just as bad as Hamas. And that's a victory for Hamas.
Elliot, I take the point that Bill argued a few minutes ago about not giving any credence to this, but Israel is not a signatory to the treaty that created the International Criminal Court, and neither is the United States. So how is it purporting to exercise jurisdiction here, and is that a troubling precedent? And I would note that Ambassador John Bolton, who is very jealous of U.S. sovereignty, has been arguing for years that this is something that Americans ought to worry about, that in some sort of conflict in Afghanistan or against ISIS, after the fact, there would be some kind of investigation by the ICC and prosecutions brought against American servicemen.
He was right. He's still right. The rule is that the ICC has jurisdiction over individuals in member states. That is, states on the one hand, and members, meaning they have signed the Rome Statute. As you said, Israel has not signed the Rome Statute. It never did. The U.S. also never did, because they saw something like this coming, that there's an unaccountable foreign prosecutor somewhere in Europe who has some sort of ideas, and this person would have incredible powers over Americans, over Israelis. Both countries have had to deal with incredible bias in various international tribunals. So what did the ICC do? It sort of twisted its rules. The first step is they say, okay, well, your country may not be a member state, but if you have committed crimes in another member state, well, then we can prosecute that based on that other country, based on that other state being an ICC member state. That makes some sense. The problem is Gaza is not a state and doesn't have the features of statehood and isn't internationally recognized as a state. And the ICC requires member states to be states. That's the main qualification. So it created a category of one, specially designed to allow prosecutions of Israel, granting member status to a non-state, which it called the State of Palestine. Now, to conjure up a formal state, you have to decide on all of its borders. Courts can't usually do that. You need internationally recognized borders. Well, the ICC said, you know, there's a sense in the international community, we can just sort of say what the borders are, Gaza, West Bank. Therefore, there is a state of Palestine. The ICC accepted the state of Palestine as a member state. Therefore, it can prosecute Israel. So this is an incredible extension of its powers. President Biden, I think, rightly says ICC has no jurisdiction here. And it's worth noting there is an open investigation, ICC investigation of U.S. troops in Afghanistan. They've left it open for years. It's an ongoing investigation. And by the way, that's part of why these requests for arrest warrants are so suspect, because the investigation moved lightning fast, even under circumstances that precluded any real investigation. Instead of taking years, the prosecutor rushed onto CNN and announced it.